An obsidian spire tears up through the Nether and pierces the overworld sky, crowned by a coal-black eye that burns with purpose. From beneath its shadow, legions of wither skeletons rise, no ordinary mobs, but a summoned army shaped by a dark will older than the game's code. The spire hums like a tuned note from a forgotten instrument, and the world feels the chord, a vibration through stone and bone, through river and root. It is not flame alone that marks its coming, it is intent. Where the obsidian breaks the clouds, day falters as if the sun itself has been asked to step aside. Shadows lengthen into spikes that prick the horizon, and the wind carries a taste of charcoal, and Ash the First cries are not of soldiers, but of creatures who garden and trade and dream beneath uncomplicated skies. Villagers in their square huts pause midweave and mid-bargain, hands frozen like puppets forgotten by a child. Farmhands looking up from tilled soil see the black eye and think of tales their grandmothers ought to have told them, but never did. The eye watches, patient as a mountain and terrible as winter. Roofs of thatch and slate cast long shadows that become banners, and small animals skitter and vanish into the tall grass. Even the fish in nearby rivers seem to feel the change, swimming deeper, where the water is cool and the world quieter adventurers, those restless souls who delight in the geometry of danger, hear the rumble on the map before they see the spire. They come from the directions favored by peril. The jagged ice mountains to the north, the tangled jungles to the south, the plains dotted with ruins where a lost temple still breathes in its sleep. They arrive in clusters, one-man scouts, pairs bound by sworn oath, and those whose names have become whispers in taverns. Their eyes are bright with curiosity first, then with the slow tightening of worry. That black eye is wrong in a way the world recognizes. It is too purpose-built, too centralized, as if a mind were compressing its will into a single instrument. When a wither skeleton steps from the shadow and lifts a sword notched with flame, the adventurers realize the danger is not merely an environmental hazard but an army's heartbeat. You can hear the city's smiths when the news reaches them. Hammers pause atop anvils like pendulums that have forgotten their rhythm. For a moment, the clang means nothing and only the obsidian spire matters. Then, almost instinctively, men and women go back to work, not to forge normal weapons, but to make things that sing at the edge of death. Swords long and thin enough to pierce worn armor, shields broader than the shoulders of common folk, and helmets with visors that narrow the world to a sliver of survival. Banners are torn from old sails and repurposed as signals. There is no festival touch to these craftings, their edges are practical and cold, and their makers move with a dedication that is equal parts dread and defiance. From the Nether, the spire thrums like a war drum calling the dead to march. Wither skeletons emerge across biomes as if some invisible tide lifts them from pits and bridges, from ravines and strongholds. They are taller than other skeletons, clothed in soot and memory, their eyes small coals and skulls like the remnants of burned vows. But there is now something in them that was not there before. Banners of obsidian etched across their backs, runes that glow faintly with the same coal-black light as the eye. They move not in disarray, but with formations honed on a battlefield of long decay. Shields in some skirmishes crack against the swing of their swords, and armor that usually repels blows splinters under the relentlessness of their assault. Yet even as fear folds into the valleys and towns, a different reaction takes shape atop the obsidian spire. The eye does not simply observe, it sends threads of shadow outwards, thin as spider silk, yet thicker than steel in their command. These threads find hearts that beat in tune with conquest. The first of these hearts belongs to those who once sought the stars and the power beneath them, a figure of legend who has now reformed in block and breath. Sauron, if the old maps still bear his name, does not stride forth like a monarch. He is a whisper that becomes form, a mantle of dark logic that wraps itself around the mechanics of the world. He understands blocks, he understands mobs, and he understands how players, how mortals, would place their bets on light and structure. He knows that in a world of crafting and code, domination is a matter of assembly as much as of terror. The spire is a lattice for that will. At its base, obsidian plates click like teeth into place, and the wither remains. A creature once summoned and bound is not merely replicated but resurrected in a legion. The familiar rituals of summoning occur again, but this time they are sung in a voice that uses the game's heartbeat as a metronome. Souls are not stolen, they are guided. Lost skeletons, withered in their griefs and grudges, answer to the summons because it promises structure where there was only decay. That promise reorders them into an army with discipline. Where once a wither skeleton would act alone, now they march in ranks that flank, press, and withdraw, as if they remember the clang of war and obey the geometry of it. Overhead, Endermen watch and do not look away. The dark tower between worlds is a provocation and a poem. These tall, gaunt creatures tilt their heads like judges at a trial. They speak in their clacking tongue to each other, bewildered and intrigued. Some flee into the end, carrying word of a change in the pattern of things that even they find unfamiliar. Others linger, restless and torn, tempted to accept new bargains whispered from the eye. The balance between realms begins to fray like a well-worn tapestry under strain. The Nether bleeds smoke into the overworld, and the sky accretes ash like a bruise. Players logging into the server at this hour find their maps flickering, compass needles spinning, as if their magnetism has been compromised by a stronger pull. The first major confrontation is not staged, but accidental. A caravan escorting a chest of rare enchanted books crosses the plains near the spire. The riders are a motley band. One carries a bow with strings plucked, so often it sings in the wind. Another bears armor patched from a dozen battles, and the third is a young mage with eyes like new glass. When the patrol encounters a patrol of wither skeletons, the suddenness of their discipline becomes evident. The skeletons do not swarm with random hunger but attack with disciplined arcs, cutting off avenues of escape. The arrows of the Bowsinger whistle through the air and find skulls, breaking some but not all. The mage opens a book and calls out a flare of light that scatters the nearest skeletons, but the light weakens against the eye's influence. The obsidian eye does not have to be near to touch the battlefield, its will reaches like tidewater. A far-off command changes the choreography of skeletons, and the caravan falls back in a now tactical retreat rather than a panicked scatter. As evening presses close, torches become beacons for small, stubborn communities. Those who can read the signs gather. Blacksmiths with soot on their forearms, witches whose brews smell strongly of iron, a retired hero too old for quests who nonetheless sharpens an old blade with hands that remember the feel of victory. They form small councils, not to debate but to decide. Their decisions are simple tremors: when to strike, where to hide, how to shield the children. The obsidian spire stands like a verdict in the distance, and every plan circles back to a single truth. You cannot ignore a spire that splits two realms and crowns itself with an eye. Rumors swell into lore by the time the moon rises. Some say the eye is a relic, built from obsidian plundered from the heart of an ancient fortress, animated by a shard of something called an one ring, whispers that echo an older malignancy. Others say the eye is an emergent property of the world, a glitch made willful and then weaponized into being. Whatever the origin, mortals make meaning quickly when faced with a threat too vast for single hands. Songs begin to shape, not yet in full chorus but in the seed of refrain. A black pillar in the sky, an army of ash and bone, and a force that does not hunger so much as design. Night after night, These songs are sung in low voices beside fires that the eye can see but cannot burn. They are whispered into earthen walls as if to strengthen them with remembrance. And in the deep places, where redstone hums like a sleeping beast, engineers and cruel inventors of pranks and war alike begin to devise counters. They study the architecture of the spire, the cadence of the skeletons, the limited range of commands that bind them. In basements and behind trapdoors, contraptions are sketched and soldered, mechanisms that might misdirect a formation, that might collapse a portion of the spire back into the nether, that might sever the faint threads of command the eye extends. The mathematicians of siegecraft whisper about vulnerabilities in obsidian latticework and in runes that glow with patterns akin to language. In that whispering, hope takes root like a stubborn weed. For now, though, the world holds its breath. The obsidian spire stands patient and obscene against the sky, its coal-black eye both promise and threat. Wither skeletons patrol roads once warm with laughter. Cattle shy away from fences where they used to sleep. The adventurers gather their courage as if it were armor and move out, compelled by a code older than fear. The first part of the chronicle closes not with a battle, but with the shape of an inevitability. Where the eye commands, bones obey. Where bones march, stories begin. The world prepares, in ways crude and noble, for the truth that a darkness has learned to assemble itself into order, and that those who would resist must do so by bending structure to their will as well, crafting hope with the same exacting hands that craft doom. The spire watches, and the night listens, and somewhere beneath the obsidian, a mind smiles with the cold pleasure of plans unfolding. The sky tore open not with lightning, but with the slow, deliberate pain of something ancient waking. From a wound in the upper air, an obsidian ring uncoiled, each block a faceted tooth, each seam a seam of darkness. It hovered above the plains like a hammer hung above a throne. Within it, a pupil of embers swam, alive with a malevolent patience. Players stopped mid-mining, pickaxes raised like prayers. Cows froze with their jaws mid-rumination. Even the river slowed, as if the world held its breath and listened. Beneath the ring, a black beam descended, not of light but of absence. It struck the highest obsidian ridge and poured itself like oil into the seams of the land. Where the beam touched, grass went brittle, turning to char and dust. Stone chilled and hummed with a pressure like the thought of a god. They called it the Obsidian Eye before any name was properly given, for names arrive slowly and belong to those who bend the world. From the nether, the response came not as whispered orders but as an answering cry. The creak of fortress gates, the clink of iron, the scrape of bone. Where the eye's beam touched the sky or ground, portals of warped air blinked like eyes within them. The silhouettes of tall, black skeletons drew up from corridors of flame, their hollow sockets bright as coals. They did not march like soldiers, they rose like a tide, each bone a black blade, each movement a memory of ruin. Where they set foot, leaves shriveled, leaves whispered last words, and the living fell away in the shadow of their passage. Sauron, whatever voice shaped that eye, needed not to speak for every skull to understand. An ancient contract of fear had been signed in the rents between dimensions. In the village beneath the ridge, a handful of adventurers gathered as if the world had taught them that small lights might stave off a vast dark. There was the miner who had lost his brother to a wither blast, and who now wrapped his hands in chains of iron. There was a mage whose eyes reflected the eye, and who spoke in runes of warding. There was a villager who refused to leave his hearth, and an iron golem whose metal had been hammered in the old wars. They watched as the wither skeleton tide pooled in the lowlands, and some among them thought to flee. But the mage's voice did not allow simple panic. She drew sigils not with brush but with a shard of redstone, and the markings flared like embers, small suns that pushed at the edges of the eye's absence. It was not enough, not yet. The eye's influence was a slow rot, and the wither skeletons were many. They moved in patterns that mocked strategy, flankings that were tides, formations that were wind, each wither skull a drumbeat in a march that smelled of char. The first clash came beneath a willow that still dared to hold leaves. The miner met a wither skeleton on a ridge of cracked stone, and for a heartbeat their lives were simple. A swing, a parry, a howl of breaking bone. When the miner's blade struck, the wither skeleton's blackness seeped like ink into the air, and for a moment the world tasted of iron and ash. He fell but did not die at once. His skin took on the pale sallow of wither, and his breath came in small blocks. The golem waded into the press and struck like a falling anvil, shattering rib and spine, and each saved life was paid back with the groan of metal around them. The obsidian eye watched as if tasting the resistance. It blinked once, and darkness bled into the edges of the sigils the redstone suns guttered. Rage is a poor ally for strategy, yet the miner felt it loosen him, and he rolled, and in the roll he plucked from the ground a shard of netherite half-buried, its edge singing with old heat. He struck again, and the blade bit through an arm. The skeleton's head spun free like a toy, and within its hollow neck a mote of crimson flitted, not a heart but a spark of command. The mage reached and seized it with a coil of rune. It cracked in her grip like a coal, and for a breath the eye recoiled, as if a tongue had been burned. That instant was a fissure in time. Villagers fled through the gap, and the iron golem hauled the miner to safety like a shepherd lifting a lamb. But the eye is patient and has little need of haste. It closed a long, slow hand over the horizon and plucked at the seams where the Nether and Overworld overlapped from fissures. There came forth not only wither skeletons, but a smell of old warfare, sulfur, coal, and the faint, metallic tang of a shadow that corrodes. The fields around the village grew black at the roots. Wheat that had promised bread turned to brittle stems that crumbled in the player's hand. Even the stone of the well cooled and, for the first time, stained of a color that was not there before. News spread in the terrible way of blocky worlds, prayers carved on wooden signs, embers sent on horses, and the clicking of redstone contraptions that sounded like Dumel's adventurers gathered from afar. A ranger, whose arrows were tipped with spectral ice, a thief who moved like a shadow through leaves, and a cleric who murmured songs that made light bloom from her palms. They came not as an army of equal ranks, but as a constellation of desperate skills, threaded together by the slender hope of a world that had not yet been named dead. Their plan was simple because the world had afforded them little luxury. Cut the eye's anchors, fight back the tides at the seams, and seek whatever kernel of command lay at the center of the obsidian disk. The ranger climbed high into a shattered tower of stone and loosed arrows that sang to the eye like small, angry stars. Some struck, and the eye's pupil wavered, spilling a rain of ash that looked like tiny bones. The thief slipped through the swarm with a dagger and a laugh, opening gaps in the ranks by cutting ropes and releasing stored explosives. The cleric knelt and planted her lanterns, spheres of light that hummed like bees, and they became islands where withered decay could not clench its teeth. Small victories stacked like cobblestones. A fortress gate fell to a well-timed blast. A portal collapsed when the clerk of runes burned through its anchor, and a column of wither skeletons toppled in a rain of falling obsidian blocks. Yet for every anchor severed, 2 more opened elsewhere. For every skull shattered, 3 more were roused. The eye was a machine of attrition, and it fed its army like a hunger that could not be sated. At the edge of the world, where sea met sky in a pixelated horizon, a new shore rose, a black tide of obsidian spires that cast long, impossible shadows. Myra, the name the villagers gave to the miner for lack of anything better, stood with netherite clenched, watching the spires and feeling in his bones a recognition older than fear. He remembered tales told in the dark about eyes in the sky, about kings who turned their gaze into weapons, stories stitched into the backbone of the world that suddenly made terrible sense. He had not thought the tales literal now, with obsidian raining and wither winds lifting the ashes of the old songs. He found that myth and code could bind each other into a very practical horror. The eye was not merely summoning skeletons, it was knitting together a dominion. It touched the sea and taught waves to curl into black obsidian. It touched the forests and taught trees to shed their leaves forever. It touched the end and whispered to endermen in a dialect of hunger they had never spoken. The world quivered at the seams, even the end silence thinned, like cloth pulled too tight over an abyss. Night fell, cube by cube, and under its chessboard gloom the eye thrummed with patient malice. Around the camp a council formed, voices low and hoarse, trading hope for plans and plans for chances. Myra proffered the netherite shard like an offering and said that he would go beneath, that he would burrow through whatever seams the eye had opened and find the disk's heart. The mage bound a ribbon of redstone to his arm, and the cleric kissed his brow. They gave him the little suns and the lanterns. And the thief slid a map into his hand, folded paper that smelled faintly of smoke and betrayal. He knelt, touched foreheads with the golem, and rose knowing that beneath the seams lay a will older than empires again. The obsidian spire bore no banners, yet it announced itself to the sky. It rose from the charred plain like a seam in the world, a black seam unstitched by some giant hand. Where its tip pierced the cloud, the weather grew unnatural, the air tasting of iron and old grief. At that crown hung an eye, an arrangement of polished obsidian and cold glass that did not blink but seemed to drink the light. It was smaller than a tower's window, but larger than any helmet seen on any soldier, and it pulsed with a slow, patient hunger. Word carried itself across broken paths and smoke. The eye had come, and those who had watched the black tides gather felt their bones tighten. Adventurers who had once cheered at the crafting table fell silent, for the eye was a thing made of the world's negation, obsidian forged into sight. It was not merely a beacon, it felt like a command, a long, slow voice without breath that called in a language older than any songbook. Bram the smith, who had once hammered sunlight into ingots beneath a roof of spruce, swore upon his anvil that the metal on his belt went cold, as though the eye's shadow had reached through even stone. Elira, whose aim could split an arrow in two with a single string, felt her hands tremble when the eye's focus swept past the smoking ridge where she crouched. She had come to hold the line between fields of ash and the nearest village, but the line had become a suggestion, a thing to be rearranged by unseen fingers. Where the eye stared, wither skeletons rose with the efficiency of a terrible factory. They came not singly but in ranks like spilled night, their bones wrapped in char and ash, their blades dull as if rubbed with old sorrow. Each carried the hollow gaze of someone who has been asked to obey and cannot remember why each moved beneath the eye's eldritch gravity as though it were a true king. Their leader, a wither bearer with a chest plate of cracked basalt, stood taller than the rest and bore a crown of black teeth. His name, known only as a growl on the wind, gathered the bones into formation with a gesture of a fingerless hand. Around the spire, the land itself split into puzzles the eye could not forgive. Fissures that breathed smoke, lakes that boiled under a lid of black glass, and trees whose leaves had hardened into shards. Travelers told of rivers flowing backward, of sheep that bleated in minor keys, and of compasses that spun until their needles broke off. The obsidian eye changed not only the land but the rules. Ores sulked deeper into rock, enchantments sighed and became tired, and daylight minimized itself to a brittle, watchful thing. Around that black beacon, wither skeletons drilled tunnels through the bedrock and stacked monuments of grief, tall obelisks of bone and obsidian that hummed with a soft, ruinous music. They raised banners of cinders, they placed skulls on pikes, and in their wake the grass turned a sickly gray, as if the land had been taught to forget how to be green. There were those who sought to tear the eye down with hammers of iron and the raw will of commoners, but iron shivered and snapped like glass when it touched the obsidian spire, and common will frayed at the edges. A circle of rune priests tried to bind it with words borrowed from the oldest tablets, chanting in tongues threaded with ash. Yet each rune burned as it was etched, leaving nothing but curls of cold smoke. The eye's gaze did not simply see it recruited, sifting the will of beasts and men like a prospector sifts ore. A wolf that had once been black rose at dawn with a rib cage, stained in night. A villager who had once traded bread now bartered in bones he never owned. The most terrible recruit was a ruin made of man and memory. A knight named Keth, who had faced ender storms and walked through silvered rain, now moved with the hollow devotion of one whose name had been erased. His sword, once etched with runes of light, carried now nothing but a silence that drank hearing where it passed. Elira watched Keth from a crumbling battlement, and did not strike him down. There are debts that bind one to another beyond combat. And the knight's hollow gate pulled at a memory in her that had her fingers unclench and her bow lower. It is easy to call a thing monstrous when it steals away the names. It is harder when the monster once carried your campfire and mended your saddle dot in response to the eye's growth. A ragged fellowship gathered, miners still streaked with ore dust, a cartographer who had folded mountains into a pocket, and a child with a stone for an amulet who said nothing and watched everything. They had no army, only stubbornness and tools, yet stubbornness is a kind of weather, and weather shapes even bedrock with enough time. Bram spoke in blunt metaphors: smash the eye or smother the light, he said, though his voice betrayed him and fell away at the sound of the eye's whisper. They tried stealth. Elira's arrows hummed like mourning and slid into the obsidian flank to no avail. Their wood charred as if the eye demanded a toll. They tried arcana. The cartographer traced sigils of place and lock, but maps folded themselves into secret shapes and hid the spire's seams from a pen. They tried to bargain. The child with the stone placed it against the eye's base and listened until the stone grew warm. It returned with a whisper no one could understand and left behind a smear like oil at night. The eye burned a slow pulse, and with each beat the wither ranks grew denser, their numbers multiplying like shadows cast by hatred. One night, beneath a sky sectioned by blackened clouds, the eye opened further and a seam of light poured from its core. Not sunlight, but a deep, violet ash that smelled of iron and old promises. From that seam stepped a figure draped in the suggestion of a robe, all angles and fractured shadow, and where its face might have been there was a single shard of obsidian that reflected no light. It walked without sound, though the ground abated, curling itself into a path like a tide turning in a grave. When this presence raised a hand, the wither bearer knelt and laid his crown of teeth at its feet. Where the crown touched obsidian, it smoldered and became a little tree of ash. The figure turned, and its motion drew the eye's focus like a puppeteer tugging a string, and the field where it looked flattened into an arena of focus and dread dot. It spoke with a voice of glass, words that felt like winter on a bone. The voice told of balance and of a world trimmed and pruned, of weeds to be cut back for a perfection only it could see. It promised purpose, and with purpose, order. It offered those lost a place to be obedient and warm in the regimentation of ruin. Some villagers stepped forward, led by hunger and by the soft consolation of not being alone, and were given helmets of dark glass that fit like a second skull. When the helmets were affixed, their eyes dimmed and their speech narrowed into assent. They did not become monsters so much as instruments, perfect and small. It was then that the ragged fellowship understood. The war was not against bone alone, but against will, against the very right to choose a path other than the spires. They could storm the monuments and smash the withers until the skeletons crunched to dust. Yet if the eye remained, men and wolves and knights would still be called into its chorus. Thus the plan grew like mold in the dark, not to shatter the eye in a single brute strike, but to unmake its music, to break its attention by threading a dozen minor rebellions through its sight. Elira would lead raids in the periphery, burning the obelisks of bone and setting snares that brought nothing but confusion. Bram would forge mirrors of polished iron to reflect the eye's gaze and scatter it like shattered glass. The cartographer would redraw the land, making false valleys and phantom roads. The child with the stone would carry out errant offerings until the eye's mind tired of deciphering them. Keth remained a specter in their plans, a question they could not answer. Elira wanted mercy, Bram wanted leverage, and the child simply wanted the stone to feel cold again. On the eve they chose, a hush fell like a linen curtain drawn over a bell. Even the wither skeletons paused, as if listening for the drumbeat of approaching war.